Hello, class, and welcome to our session for this week. I just want to highlight a few things on PowerPoint for the class today. When we think about the Constitution, it's really important that we remember the foundations of the Constitution and the process that led to the framers of our Constitution abandoning the Articles of Confederation and embracing the Philadelphia Conference that eventually led to the creation of the US Constitution. And take some time to look at the PowerPoint on the foundations of the Constitution, and thinking about the issue of the 1750s, the French-Indian War, and how that depleted the coffers of the British, King George III, and specifically led to rising taxation on the colonists by George III, the King of England at the time. Also, keep in mind that the Declaration of Independence, the sentiment for independence, was heavily influenced by the rising taxes and the challenge to the authority of the King, George III, in the period after the French-Indian War. Part of the issue with George III was he needed to raise taxes on the colonists because of the expenses that the English had incurred in bringing troops over from Europe to fight in the Ohio River Valley in support of the colonists. However, for the colonists, they were very concerned about the increased taxation from the king, and they felt it was an injustice and a violation of their liberties. The original document before we had the US Constitution was the Articles of Confederation, which were adopted in 1781. And part of the challenge with the Articles of Confederation, and the reason we had to do away with them, is that they had no executive branch. So you didn't have a president, you didn't have an executive arm to enforce the law. There was also no central government to collect taxes. So every state kind of opted in and opted out of this loose confederation. There was no federal judiciary to settle interstate disputes. And there was also no regulation of interstate commerce or foreign commerce. And that creates this inherent problem in relation to provision of resources, taxes, to be able to provide for public goods that citizens of the states would require. And when thinking about public goods, we're thinking things like the infrastructure, public safety, general governance, and government institutions around the country. So these were some of the foundational issues around challenges of the Articles of Confederation. And other post-revolutionary issues that the colonists were faced with were issues around the huge war debt that the 13 colonies had after the Revolutionary War. Part of the challenge Alexander Hamilton had at the time was trying to convince the other framers of the Constitution, the founding fathers, that this war debt had to be spread and shared by all the states, in spite of the fact that some states, like New York, had suffered significant damage during the Revolutionary War because a lot of those battles were fought in particular states and not others. So New York, New Jersey tended to have a lot more damage than other states like, say, Georgia or South Carolina. So this was part of the other issue. There was also issues around conflicting state trade agreements between different states and foreign trading partners. There was the continuing threat of the British on the high seas, because the British still controlled the waterways. They had a very powerful navy, and they were reluctant to allow free flow of trade with the rebellious former colonies. An important constituent that led to the promulgation of the US Constitution, that hastened the process of the US Constitution being created, was Shay's Rebellion. And this happened in Massachusetts, specifically around the issue of farmers who were former revolutionary fighters losing their land because they were not able to pay the taxes on that land. Shay's Rebellion was a direct threat to law and order, a direct threat to the survival of the states. And as a result of the governor of Massachusetts having to raise a private militia to bring down Shay's Rebellion, this hastened the process to have the Philadelphia Conference and eventually the Constitutional Conference in Philadelphia to come up with the US Constitution. So certain key terms that I'd like us to think about for this week: the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, and thinking about how these plans are relevant within the broader framework of the US Constitution. And then the construction of the Great Compromise and how that was useful in establishing the US Constitution eventually. We also have the 3/5 Compromise around the issue of slavery and how slaves would be counted. Take a note of that in terms of your readings. Bicameral, which is a two-chambered legislature. The upper house, which in our context is the Senate, and the lower house, which is the House of Representatives. Issues around checks and balances. This is how we understand the system of government divided between the roles of the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative arms of government. The Bill of Rights, which were the 10 amendments that were added to the original Constitution before it was ratified in Philadelphia. Thinking about issues of separation of powers, how the powers of the executive, legislature, and judiciary are separated and who does what. So the judiciary interprets the law, the executive enforces the law, and the legislature makes the law. Also think about express powers versus reserved powers. Express powers or enumerated powers are those powers of the national or federal government. Reserved powers are the powers of the states, which states have by virtue of the 10th Amendment. Think about the elastic clause, which is what we also call the necessary and proper clause. Also reflect on judicial review and the power of judicial review. This is a judicial act that's unique to the United States by virtue of a state case precedent called Marbury versus Madison in 1803. And judicial review essentially is the process through which the Supreme Court can declare congressional mandates to be null and void when they violate the Constitution. They can be declared unconstitutional. Lastly, the Supremacy Clause. And the Supremacy Clause has to deal with the supremacy of the US Constitution. In other words, should there be a conflict between the US Constitution and state or local statutes, then the US Constitution takes precedence. So I'd also like you to take a quick view of a YouTube clip that I have posted online. It provides a basic overview on some of the foundational concepts of American government. In conclusion, please stay safe and healthy. Remember to email me anytime should you have any concerns or questions, and I'll be glad to help you with those. Stay safe and healthy and have a nice day.